There is a brief instant before a real change happens, and most people miss it. Not because it's hidden, but because it doesn't look important at first. It feels like a pause you didn't plan for, a moment where the world seems slightly out of sync with who you are becoming. Nothing collapses, nothing announces itself, yet something inside you knows that continuing the same way is no longer possible. You may have felt it already. A quiet sense that the familiar no longer fits, even though it still works, that something is shifting beneath your routines, your thoughts, your sense of time. The question isn't whether change is coming. It's this: if there were a precise inner threshold, visible only for a moment, would you recognize it or would you explain it away and move on? Because this moment doesn't return the same way twice. The old consciousness doesn't collapse with noise. There are no alarms, no public announcements, no dramatic before and after line you can point to on a calendar. It happens quietly, almost politely while you're still functioning. You wake up, go through familiar motions, answer messages, make decisions that look reasonable from the outside. Yet something underneath has begun to give way, like a structure that no longer supports the weight placed on it. At first, the signs are easy to misread. You might think you're just tired, distracted, or less motivated than you used to be. Things that once gave you a sense of purpose now feel oddly flat. Conversations repeat themselves. Goals you worked toward for years suddenly feel borrowed, as if they belong to someone you no longer are. Nothing is wrong enough to justify a crisis, but nothing is right enough to feel alive. This is how the old consciousness protects itself, by making the collapse feel like a personal flaw instead of a structural failure. The old model was built for efficiency and survival, not depth. It rewarded speed, certainty, and constant comparison. Think of it as a system that runs on shortcuts. Labels replace curiosity, opinions replace observation, reactions replace choice. For a long time, this system works well enough. It helps you navigate education, career, family roles, social expectations. But eventually the environment changes. The volume of information increases, contradictions pile up, the gap between what you feel and what you're supposed to feel widens. The same shortcuts start producing errors. You may notice this when your attention becomes restless. You consume more content but retain less meaning. You make decisions faster, yet trust them less. Even moments of rest feel crowded, as if your mind can't fully stand down. The old consciousness interprets this as a need for better control, more planning, more optimization, more external input. But control was never the solution. It was a compensatory habit. When the habit stops working, the strain becomes visible. There's also a subtler signal. Your emotional reactions stop matching the situations that trigger them. A small inconvenience provokes disproportionate irritation. A major achievement barely registers. This mismatch isn't random. It reflects a system that no longer aligns with your internal state. The old consciousness depends on predictable emotional loops. When those loops break, it loses coherence. You feel it as inner noise, a background hum of dissatisfaction without a clear cause. This is where many people double down on explanations that keep them stuck. They blame age, the economy, other people, the times we live in. Some turn the collapse into a story of decline. This is just how life gets. Others chase constant stimulation to avoid noticing the emptiness between moments. Both strategies preserve the old structure by refusing to question its assumptions. And one of those assumptions is crucial, that consciousness is a fixed container rather than a dynamic field. The collapse accelerates when you start noticing patterns instead of isolated events. You see how often your thoughts repeat themselves. You catch the same internal arguments looping with different characters. You recognize how quickly you adopt other people's urgency, fears, and priorities without checking whether they're relevant to your actual experience. This recognition can be uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of individuality the old consciousness relied on. If these patterns aren't uniquely yours, then who has been choosing? There's a moment, often brief, when this question surfaces without an immediate answer. It might happen while driving, or standing in line, or waking up in the middle of the night. The usual mental commentary pauses and you sense a gap. Not silence exactly, but space. The old consciousness experiences this gap as threatening. It rushes to fill it with distraction or explanation. Yet this gap is not a void. It's the first sign that the structure is loosening. Biologically, nothing dramatic is required. You're still the same body, the same nervous system. But the way attention organizes experience is shifting. Instead of automatically collapsing everything into judgments and narratives, it hesitates. That hesitation is costly for a system built on speed. The old consciousness can't survive long pauses. It needs immediate meaning, even if the meaning is inaccurate. When pauses increase, its authority weakens. You might test this for yourself in a simple way. Notice how often you reach for an interpretation before you've fully registered what you're feeling. Notice how quickly you name an emotion instead of staying with the physical sensation. This naming once felt helpful. Now it feels reductive. The collapse shows up as a loss of trust in your own labels. Words feel thinner than the experience they're trying to contain. Another sign is a growing intolerance for incoherence. You become less willing to hold beliefs that contradict your direct observation, even if those beliefs once gave you comfort or social belonging. This doesn't make you cynical, it makes you precise. Precision, however, destabilizes systems built on approximation. The old consciousness prefers stories that almost fit. Precision exposes where they don't. What's important to understand is that this collapse isn't a failure to be fixed. It's a shedding. The old consciousness did its job. It helped you survive, adapt, and function in a certain context. But it cannot guide you through what comes next, because what comes next requires a different relationship with attention, time, and meaning. As the old structure weakens, you may feel disoriented, as if you've lost a map without being given a new one. That disorientation is not the end of clarity. It's the threshold. And just beyond it, something else begins to register, subtle at first, about where answers have been misplaced, and why looking outward has started to feel strangely insufficient. The invisible mistake isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself as an error, and that's why it persists for so long. It feels responsible, even intelligent. You were taught to look outward for orientation, to experts, systems, methods, opinions, trends. When something feels off inside, the reflex is to assume that the missing piece exists somewhere else, already formed, waiting to be discovered and applied. This habit once made sense. It helped you learn, adapt, and survive. But at a certain point, it becomes the very mechanism that keeps you stuck. The mistake isn't that external information is useless, it's that it quietly replaced direct perception. Over time, you learn to trust explanations more than experience, frameworks more than sensation. When uncertainty appeared, you reached for concepts instead of staying with the raw data of what you were actually feeling. This created a subtle inversion. Reality began to be filtered through borrowed understanding before it was fully registered. The result is a persistent sense that something is always slightly out of sync. You can see this inversion in how quickly the mind demands clarity. The moment ambiguity shows up, there's pressure to resolve it, to name it, to categorize it, to turn it into something manageable. But ambiguity is not an error state, it's a transitional one. When you rush past it, you skip the phase where deeper signals emerge. The old habit tells you that not knowing is dangerous, that hesitation means weakness. In truth, constant certainty is what limits movement. There's also a timing issue most people miss. External answers arrive late. By the time advice, analysis, or validation reaches you, your internal state has already shifted. You're applying yesterday's map to today's terrain. This delay creates friction. Decisions feel heavy, adjustments feel forced. You start blaming yourself for not being disciplined enough or insightful enough, without noticing that the reference point itself is outdated. This mistake is reinforced by culture in ways that are hard to see because they're normalized. Productivity language rewards output over alignment. Self-improvement narratives frame the inner world as a problem to be solved rather than a field to be listened to. Even spiritual language can fall into this trap when it turns awareness into another technique to master. The common thread is the same. Look elsewhere, accumulate more, optimize harder. At some point, this strategy produces diminishing returns. You read another book, watch another talk, adopt another model, and feel a brief lift followed by the same baseline unease. The lift comes from novelty, not integration. Integration requires something quieter, sustained attention to what is already present before it's interpreted. This is where the old habit resists the most, because it feels unproductive. There's nothing to show for it immediately. No metric improves on command. Notice how often you override your own signals. Hunger replaced by schedules. Fatigue overridden by obligation. Curiosity postponed because it doesn't fit a plan. Each override is small, almost reasonable. But accumulated, they train the nervous system to distrust itself. When that trust erodes, you compensate by seeking more external confirmation. The loop tightens. You feel guided, yet disconnected, informed, yet unsure. There's a particular discomfort that appears when this mistake begins to surface. It's not anxiety in the usual sense. It's a subtle irritation with advice itself. Suggestions that once felt helpful now feel intrusive, not because they're wrong, but because they arrive too early, before you've had space to sense your own orientation. This irritation is often misread as resistance or arrogance. In reality, it's a recalibration. Your system is asking for first contact with experience, not second-hand summaries. Bias plays a role here, and it's worth noticing without judgment. When you look outside for answers, you also look for confirmation. You're more likely to notice information that supports what you already believe and to ignore what doesn't fit. This creates the illusion of progress while keeping the underlying structure intact. The mistake survives because it feels like movement, but movement without direction is just activity. Try observing what happens when you delay interpretation, even briefly. When a feeling arises, resist the urge to explain it. Let it remain undefined long enough to reveal its texture. Where is it located? Does it change when you breathe differently? Does it intensify or soften when you stop trying to fix it? These questions aren't techniques, they're interruptions of the old reflex. Each interruption loosens the grip of the external first habit. What begins to emerge is a different kind of orientation, less verbal, less urgent. You may notice that some questions dissolve on their own when you stop chasing answers. Others sharpen, becoming more precise. Precision here doesn't come from analysis, but from resonance. Something either fits your current state or it doesn't. This discernment was always available, but it was buried under layers of interpretation. The invisible mistake was never about ignorance. It was about misplaced trust, trusting maps over terrain, trusting conclusions over contact. As this becomes clearer, another shift starts to press in quietly. The sense that time itself behaves differently when you're no longer racing to resolve everything immediately. Moments stretch or compress in unexpected ways. Days feel faster, yet certain instants feel unusually dense, as if more is happening inside them than before. This isn't a metaphor. It's a perceptual change that begins to reveal how deeply your experience of time is tied to where attention lives. Something is happening to time, but it's not happening on clocks. Schedules still look the same. Hours still contain 60 minutes. Yet your lived experience of time has begun to behave differently, and that difference is subtle enough to be dismissed, until it isn't. Days seem to disappear without leaving much behind, while certain moments feel unusually dense, as if they carry more weight than their duration should allow. This isn't imagination. It's perception reorganizing itself. The old consciousness experienced time as a straight line to be filled. You moved from task to task, milestone to milestone, with a sense that meaning would accumulate through sequence. First this, then that, and eventually something would add up. Time was something you used, spent, or ran out of. That model worked as long as attention stayed fragmented and externally guided. But as attention begins to turn inward, linear time starts to lose its dominance. You may notice this first as speed. Everything feels faster, even when your routines haven't changed. Information arrives in thicker waves. Decisions are demanded with less notice. Transitions that once took years now seem to happen in months. The reflex is to assume that the world has accelerated, and in some ways it has. But acceleration alone doesn't explain the internal effect. What's changing is how much of each moment you actually inhabit. When attention is scattered, time feels long and heavy. Waiting is uncomfortable. Silence feels awkward. But when attention gathers, when it becomes less reactive and more present, time compresses. A conversation ends sooner than expected. An afternoon vanishes while you're absorbed in something meaningful. This compression can feel unsettling if you're still measuring life by duration rather than depth. You start wondering where the day went without realizing that you were actually there for more of it. There's also a strange reversal that begins to occur. Planning far into the future becomes harder, while sensing the immediate next step becomes easier. Long-term projections feel abstract, almost fictional. Meanwhile, small timing cues feel precise. You know when to speak and when to wait, when to stop pushing, when to let something unfold. This isn't indecision, it's responsiveness. The old consciousness confuses responsiveness with lack of control because it can't quantify it. Memory behaves differently too. Instead of recalling life as a continuous story, you remember it in clusters. Certain moments stand out vividly, while entire weeks blur together. This can be alarming if you equate memory density with significance. But memory is shaped by attention, not importance. As attention shifts, so does what gets encoded. You're not losing time, you're losing redundancy. There's a biological layer to this that's often overlooked. Your nervous system doesn't track time objectively, it tracks change. When change is minimal and repetitive, time drags. When change is rich and coherent, time collapses. As the old patterns dissolve and new ones haven't fully formed, your system is flooded with novelty. Even uncertainty counts as novelty. The result is a sense that time is slipping, when in fact your perception is updating more frequently. This update can feel destabilizing because many identities are anchored in timelines. Who you are was tied to where you were headed, how long things were supposed to take, and what should have happened by now. When time loosens, these reference points wobble. You may feel untethered, as if you're floating slightly ahead of or behind your own life. The temptation is to force yourself back into familiar rhythms, but that effort often increases friction. Notice how impatience shows up differently now. It's less about wanting things sooner and more about wanting things to make sense. Waiting isn't the problem. Waiting without coherence is. You can sit quietly for a long time if the moment feels aligned, but a few minutes of misalignment can feel unbearable. This sensitivity is not a flaw. It's a signal that your internal timing has become more refined than the external structures you're moving through. Another bias becomes visible here. When time feels unstable, the mind looks for explanations that restore predictability. You might attribute the sensation to stress, age, or distraction. Those explanations aren't entirely wrong, but they're incomplete. They reduce a perceptual shift to a personal deficiency. This keeps you trying to fix yourself, instead of noticing what your experience is actually revealing. What it's revealing is that time is not a neutral backdrop. It's a function of how consciousness organizes experience. When consciousness expands, it doesn't just include more content, it changes the frame itself. Moments stop lining up neatly because you're no longer processing them through the same filters. Past, present, and future feel closer together, sometimes overlapping. Insights arrive before you can trace their origin. Understanding precedes explanation. This can create a mild sense of disorientation, especially when interacting with systems that still operate strictly on linear time. Deadlines, expectations, and routines may feel oddly artificial even when you respect them. You begin to sense that much of what passes for urgency is manufactured, not deliberately, but structurally. The old consciousness needed urgency to stay engaged. Without it, its momentum collapses. As time becomes less rigid, another realization edges closer. If your perception of time can change without effort, what else has been shaping you without your consent? You start to see how rhythms, narratives, and repeated messages have trained your sense of what is normal, possible, or urgent. This recognition doesn't arrive as a theory. It arrives as a feeling that many of your thoughts don't originate where you assumed they did. And with that feeling comes the first hint that something else has been quietly influencing your inner landscape all along, adjusting signals, preferences, and beliefs in ways you're only now beginning to notice. You are being reprogrammed, but not in the dramatic way the word usually suggests. There is no single moment where something is installed or removed, no clear switch from before to after. The process is gradual, ambient, woven into repetition, and precisely because it feels ordinary, it goes unnoticed for most of your life. Reprogramming doesn't require force, it requires exposure. What you hear repeatedly becomes familiar. What is familiar becomes believable. What is believable becomes invisible. Over time, this sequence trains not just your thoughts, but your expectations, your emotional reflexes, and even what your body prepares for before you consciously decide anything. You begin to anticipate the world in very specific ways, without remembering when you learned to do so. Most of this learning happened early. You absorbed tones before arguments, urgency before reasons, approval before understanding. Long before you could evaluate ideas, your nervous system learned what felt safe, what felt risky, and what felt normal. Later, culture, media, institutions, and social roles layered themselves on top of that foundation. None of this required conspiracy or intention. Systems don't need awareness to shape behavior. They only need consistency. You can see traces of this programming in your reactions. Notice how quickly certain topics trigger certainty, irritation, or defensiveness, even when you don't have strong personal stakes. Notice how some possibilities feel unrealistic before you've examined them, while others feel inevitable without evidence. These reactions are not conclusions. They are conditioned responses. They arise faster than thought, which is why they feel like truth. The mind often takes credit for decisions it didn't initiate. By the time you decide something, your body has already shifted toward or away from it. Muscles tense or relax. Breath changes. Attention narrows or opens. Thought arrives afterward, explaining what has already begun. This explanation is usually coherent, which makes it convincing. But coherence is not the same as authorship. The reprogramming becomes more visible when it starts to fail. Ideas that once motivated you no longer carry energy. Incentives that once worked feel hollow. You follow the same scripts and notice diminishing returns. This isn't because you're broken or ungrateful. It's because the internal software was written for conditions that no longer exist. When the environment changes faster than the code updates, friction appears. At first, this friction is interpreted as personal resistance. You might tell yourself you're procrastinating, losing discipline, or becoming cynical. But look closer. Often what's happening is that an instruction is running without context. You're responding to outdated signals. The discomfort is feedback, not failure. It's information pointing to a mismatch between conditioning and current reality. There's a common bias that keeps this hidden, the belief that your thoughts are primarily self-generated. This belief feels intuitive, but it's rarely examined. When you start observing your inner dialogue, you may notice how much of it echoes phrases, concerns, and values you've encountered elsewhere. Even the way you criticize yourself often mirrors external voices you once internalized. The reprogramming didn't stop when you became an adult, it simply became subtler. What's changing now is not that programming exists, but that it's becoming unstable. Repetition no longer guarantees compliance. Messages that once slipped past unnoticed now feel intrusive or exaggerated. You sense an overreach even if you can't articulate it. This sensitivity is not paranoia, it's discernment returning after a long period of outsourcing. The nervous system plays a key role here. It is designed to detect patterns and conserve energy by automating responses. Automation is efficient, but it's not intelligent. It can't tell when conditions have shifted unless something interrupts the loop. That interruption often arrives as fatigue, boredom, or a vague sense of meaninglessness. These states are usually treated as problems to eliminate. In reality, they are pauses that allow re-evaluation. If you sit with that pause instead of rushing to fill it, something interesting happens. You begin to notice how many impulses are not yours in any deep sense. The urge to check, to compare, to react immediately. The pressure to have an opinion. The fear of falling behind an invisible schedule. None of these are inherent. They were learned through repeated exposure to certain rhythms and rewards. This doesn't mean you can simply uninstall them. Reprogramming isn't undone by willpower, it changes through attention. What you repeatedly attend to gains influence. What you stop feeding begins to weaken. This process is slow enough to be frustrating and subtle enough to be doubted. You might wonder whether anything is actually changing. That doubt itself is often part of the old program, which equates change with visible effort. As the reprogramming loosens, you may feel strangely unanchored. Without the familiar cues telling you what matters, there can be a period of uncertainty. Old motivations fall away before new ones stabilize. This is where many people retreat, choosing familiar discomfort over unfamiliar openness. But if you stay with the uncertainty, you start to sense something else taking shape. Not as a belief, but as a signal. You begin to notice that your presence itself has an effect, that your internal state influences interactions before words are exchanged, that certain environments feel supportive or draining independent of logic. This isn't mystical. It's sensitivity returning to a system that had been numbed by constant instruction. And as this sensitivity sharpens, it draws attention to something that was always active but rarely acknowledged. The field you're continuously emitting, and how consistently reality seems to respond to it. Your field is emitting signals long before you form a sentence, long before you decide what you think or what you want. This is not metaphorical. Every nervous system broadcasts patterns through posture, tone, micro-movement and rhythm. Even in silence, something is being expressed. And just as importantly, something is being read. Most of this exchange happens beneath awareness, which is why it feels like reality is simply happening to you rather than responding. The old consciousness assumed causality worked only one way. You acted, then the world reacted. You spoke, then people responded. You made choices, then outcomes followed. But as that model loosens, a more immediate layer becomes visible. Before action, there is state. Before intention, there is coherence or noise. The quality of this state shapes what is possible in the moment, often more decisively than effort or strategy. You may have noticed that on certain days, things align with minimal friction. Conversations flow. Opportunities appear without forcing. Decisions feel timed rather than rushed. On other days, nothing quite works. Messages are misunderstood. Small obstacles multiply. The temptation is to attribute this to luck, mood, or external circumstances. But those explanations stop short of the underlying pattern. Your internal organization is being mirrored back to you. This isn't about positive thinking or emotional control. In fact, trying to manipulate your state usually increases incoherence. The signal your field emits is not determined by what you claim to feel, but by what your system is actually processing. Suppressed tension leaks. Unresolved conflict broadcasts. So does clarity. So does steadiness. The body cannot lie convincingly for long. Think of your field less as an aura and more as a tuning. Like an instrument, it can be in or out of tune regardless of how loudly it plays. When the tuning is off, even correct notes sound strained. When it's aligned, even simple notes carry resonance. Life responds not to complexity, but to coherence. This is why effort sometimes backfires, while restraint opens doors. There's a subtle feedback loop at work. Your field influences how others behave toward you, which then reinforces your internal state. If you're braced for resistance, you'll often encounter it, not because the world is hostile, but because your signals prime certain responses. This doesn't mean you're to blame for everything that happens. It means you're participating at a deeper level than you were taught to notice. Bias enters here in a quiet way. When something goes wrong, you're more likely to look for external causes. When something goes right, you may credit your actions or luck. Rarely do you consider the baseline state you were carrying into the situation. That baseline is so familiar, it becomes invisible. Yet it's the most consistent variable in your experience. As reprogramming loosens and time perception shifts, sensitivity to this baseline increases. You begin to feel when you're internally scattered versus when you're settled. The difference isn't dramatic, but it's decisive. In a scattered state, you chase outcomes. In a settled one, outcomes seem to approach you. This contrast can feel unsettling because it challenges the idea that control comes from force. Notice how little is required to change the signal. Not affirmations or visualizations, but small adjustments in attention. When you stop rehearsing imaginary conflicts. When you allow the body to release unnecessary tension. When you pause before responding, not to calculate but to feel. These moments recalibrate the field more effectively than any mental strategy. There's also a timing element. Signals are strongest at transitions, when entering a room, when beginning a conversation, when shifting from rest to action. If your system is rushed or fragmented at these thresholds, that quality carries forward. If it's coherent, the coherence propagates. You've likely felt this without naming it. The sense that how you start matters disproportionately. This awareness can initially create self-consciousness. You may worry about managing your state correctly, emitting the right signal. That worry itself adds noise. The field responds best to honesty, not optimization. Coherence doesn't mean calm all the time. It means alignment between what you feel, what you allow, and what you express. A clear sadness is more coherent than forced enthusiasm. As this becomes clearer, you might start questioning attraction itself. Why certain people enter your life now and not before? Why some paths close while others open without explanation? The old model framed these shifts as coincidence or fate. The emerging model sees them as resonance, not mystical destiny, but pattern matching at levels beneath deliberate choice. This doesn't make you omnipotent, it makes you participatory. Reality is not waiting for commands, it's responding to conditions. And your field is one of those conditions, continuously updated. As you sense this, attention naturally turns toward a more precise question. Not, how do I get what I want? But, what am I consistently transmitting without realizing it? That question doesn't demand an answer right away. It creates a listening stance. And in that listening, you begin to approach a threshold where signals intensify, where confusion often peaks, and where many people turn back just as something decisive is about to happen. The exact moment of the turning point is rarely dramatic. It doesn't arrive with certainty or relief. More often, it shows up as confusion that refuses to resolve. You feel suspended between ways of being, no longer able to fully inhabit the old, not yet oriented in the new. From the outside, nothing may look different. Inside, the familiar reference points stop working at the same time. This overlap is brief, unstable, and easy to miss, which is why so few recognize it for what it is. At this point, the strategies that carried you this far begin to fail simultaneously. Thinking harder doesn't bring clarity. Waiting for motivation doesn't restore momentum. External validation feels strangely irrelevant, even when it's available. The mind interprets this as a problem to solve, but every attempt to fix it increases the sense of friction. The turning point hides behind this friction. It's concealed by your own intelligence, by the reflex to regain control, instead of noticing why control has become ineffective. What makes this moment difficult is that it doesn't feel like progress. It feels like loss of orientation. You may question your judgment, your direction, even your sanity in subtle ways. The old consciousness frames this as regression. I used to know what I was doing, but that certainty was built on a structure that has already collapsed. What you're experiencing now is not the absence of direction, but the absence of imposed direction. There's a difference, and it matters. Fear often enters here not as panic, but as hesitation, a sense that if you let go completely, something essential might be lost. Identity is implicated. Roles that once defined you no longer feel accurate, yet stepping beyond them feels irresponsible or risky. The turning point tests how tightly you cling to continuity. It asks, without words, whether you trust coherence more than familiarity. Many people turn back at this stage, and not because they lack courage. They turn back because the nervous system prefers known discomfort over unknown openness. Going back restores predictability. You can readopt old goals, old narratives, old urgencies. They still function well enough to numb the deeper question. Life resumes its rhythm. On the surface, this looks like stability. Underneath, the same tension waits, ready to resurface later. Those who don't turn back often can't explain why. It's not a heroic decision, it's more like an inability to fully re-enter the old frame. Something has been seen that can't be unseen. Even if you try to convince yourself otherwise, the body knows. Old motivations feel hollow when you attempt to revive them. Old fears lose their leverage. You may still feel afraid, but the fear no longer organizes your choices the way it used to. There is a peculiar quietness at the center of this moment. Not peace, but stillness. Action pauses not because you're stuck, but because impulse and reaction are no longer leading. This pause can feel empty if you expect direction to arrive as a thought. It doesn't. Direction begins to appear as alignment, a sense of right timing rather than right reasoning. This is subtle enough that it's easy to override by returning to analysis. Bias is especially active here. The mind scans for evidence that this uncertainty is a mistake. It compares you to others who seem more certain, more productive, more settled. But what you're comparing is surface coherence, not internal alignment. Many people appear stable because they never left the old structure. Stability and stagnation look identical from a distance. Another distortion appears around urgency. You may feel pressure to decide quickly, to resolve the ambiguity before it costs you something. But the turning point doesn't respond to pressure. It responds to honesty. The more you try to force clarity, the more it recedes. The moment asks for tolerance of not knowing, not as a philosophy, but as a lived state. Physically, this period can register as odd fluctuations. Bursts of energy followed by sudden fatigue, heightened sensitivity to noise, crowds, or shallow conversation, a pull toward simplicity. These are not symptoms to eliminate, they're adjustments. Your system is recalibrating thresholds. What once passed unnoticed now feels intrusive. What once required effort now feels natural. You might notice that your attention becomes more selective without trying. Certain inputs lose their grip. Others draw you in deeply. This selectivity isn't preference, it's resonance. The turning point sharpens this distinction. It doesn't tell you what to choose, but it makes misalignment harder to tolerate. That intolerance is often mistaken for rigidity, when it's actually refinement. If there is a decision here, it's not about direction but orientation, whether you relate to experience from the surface or from the source. The turning point is the first time this choice becomes experiential rather than conceptual. You feel the difference between reacting to appearances and responding from something quieter underneath. Once felt, this difference becomes a reference, even if you can't access it at will. As this reference stabilizes, something else begins to stand out. Beneath opinions, beneath beliefs, beneath the need to explain what's happening, there's a sense of truth that isn't argued into place. It's felt as coherence, as a reduction in inner noise, as a clarity that doesn't need to convince. And as this frequency becomes perceptible, it starts to reorganize how you understand reality itself, not as something to believe in, but as something you're already participating in as the observer. The frequency of truth is not an idea you adopt or a belief you defend. It's something you recognize often before you can explain it. When it's present, there's a distinct quality to experience. Less internal resistance, fewer mental negotiations, a quiet sense of alignment that doesn't depend on agreement or approval. Truth, in this sense, isn't loud. It doesn't argue. It stabilizes. Most people were taught to treat truth as content, a statement to verify, a position to hold, a conclusion reached through reasoning or authority. That version of truth lives at the level of language. The frequency of truth operates at a deeper layer. It's registered by the nervous system before it's processed by thought. You feel it as coherence, as something clicking into place without force. This is why certain explanations can be factually correct yet feel empty, while others feel immediately real even before you fully understand them. The difference isn't logic, it's resonance. When something aligns with your direct perception, the body relaxes. Breath deepens slightly. Mental noise decreases. These signals are subtle but consistent. They don't prove anything to others, but they orient you. The old consciousness relied heavily on consensus. If enough people agreed, something felt true. If it was endorsed by authority or repeated often, it gained weight. That model is breaking down because consensus has become unstable. Contradictory narratives coexist openly. Expertise is fragmented. Certainty is constantly challenged. In this environment, external validation loses its anchoring power. You're left with a question that can't be outsourced. How do you know when something is true for you? The frequency of truth answers that question indirectly. It doesn't give you certainty about outcomes. It gives you clarity about alignment. You may still not know what will happen, but you sense whether a direction is coherent or forced. This distinction matters more than prediction. Coherent choices tend to simplify over time. Forced ones accumulate friction. There's a common misunderstanding here. People assume that truth should feel pleasant. It doesn't have to. Sometimes it feels sobering. Sometimes it dismantles comforting stories. What distinguishes it is not comfort, but steadiness. Even when the truth is uncomfortable, there's less internal argument around it. You stop trying to persuade yourself. The energy previously spent on justification becomes available. Science brushes up against this more than it openly admits. The observer effect, for example, isn't just a quirk of measurement. It points to a deeper principle. The state of the observer matters. What you notice, how you notice, and what you expect all influence what becomes real in your experience. This isn't mystical. It's practical. Attention is not neutral. It shapes perception, and perception shapes response. When you operate from the frequency of truth, attention becomes cleaner. You're less pulled by irrelevant stimuli, less reactive to manufactured urgency. This doesn't make you detached, it makes you precise. You respond to what's actually happening, not to what you've been conditioned to fear or desire. Precision reduces noise, and reduced noise makes patterns visible. One of those patterns is how rarely truth needs defending. Lies and distortions require maintenance. They need repetition, reinforcement, and emotional charge to stay in place. Truth, once recognized, tends to persist quietly. You may forget it temporarily, but when you encounter it again, recognition is immediate. There's a sense of return rather than discovery. Bias still operates, even here. The mind may try to co-opt this recognition, turning it into another identity. I know the truth. That move reintroduces separation. The frequency of truth isn't something you possess, it's something you tune into. Lose the tuning, and it fades. This keeps the process honest. It prevents certainty from hardening into dogma. As this tuning becomes more familiar, you may notice a shift in how you relate to disagreement. You don't need to convince others as much. Not because you're indifferent, but because you recognize that coherence can't be transmitted by force. Each system has to detect it internally. This changes how you listen. You hear not just words, but the state behind them. Some arguments dissolve when you sense the insecurity driving them. This is also where solitude gains a different quality. Being alone no longer feels like lack of stimulation, but like reduced interference. In quieter conditions, the frequency of truth is easier to detect. Not because it hides in silence, but because noise masks it. This doesn't mean withdrawing from the world. It means relating to it from a less contaminated signal. As your sensitivity increases, another realization begins to form. Not everyone is oriented toward this frequency, and not everyone wants to be. Some people are invested in maintaining familiar narratives, roles, and hierarchies. Truth, when it destabilizes those structures, feels threatening. You may notice subtle distancing, conversations that no longer land, shared assumptions that quietly dissolve. This can be confusing at first. You haven't rejected anyone. You haven't declared a new belief. Yet something has shifted. The frequency you're tuning into doesn't harmonize with every environment or relationship. This isn't a moral judgment. It's a mechanical one. Systems resonate or they don't. As this becomes clearer, a quieter shock approaches. Not as drama, but as recognition. The understanding that this shift doesn't happen collectively, and that some of the people closest to you may not perceive what you're perceiving. Not because they can't, but because they won't. The shock doesn't arrive as betrayal or conflict. It arrives as a quiet realization that some people can no longer meet you where you are. Not because you've become better or worse, but because your orientation has changed. The frequency you're tuning into no longer harmonizes with every relationship, environment, or shared story that once felt natural. This is rarely discussed honestly, because it challenges a comforting belief that growth is something everyone does together. At first, you try to explain yourself, not in grand declarations, but in small clarifications. You choose words more carefully. You pause instead of reacting. You stop feeding certain conversations. And slowly, you notice that these changes don't always land. Some people respond with confusion, others with subtle resistance, a few with concern disguised as advice. You're overthinking. You've changed. Why make things so complicated? None of this is malicious. It's dissonance. What's shocking is not that disagreement exists, but that connection weakens even without disagreement. You can still care deeply about someone and feel that the channel between you has narrowed. Shared references stop working. Jokes fall flat. Silences stretch in unfamiliar ways. The old rhythm isn't there, and forcing it feels false. This can feel like loss, even when no one has gone anywhere. The old consciousness expected evolution to be communal. Families grow together. Friendships mature in parallel. If one person changes, others are assumed to follow or at least understand. But consciousness doesn't scale like that. It reorganizes individually through lived perception, not persuasion. No amount of explanation can substitute for someone else's internal recognition. This is one of the hardest truths to accept because it removes the hope that clarity alone can bridge every gap. There's often a period of self-doubt here. You wonder if you're becoming isolated, arrogant, or detached. You check yourself for rigidity. This is healthy. But if you look honestly, you'll notice that the separation isn't coming from judgment. It's coming from reduced participation in certain patterns. You're no longer reinforcing what once held the bond together. Without that reinforcement, the structure weakens on its own. Some relationships were built on shared urgency, others on shared complaint, others on shared distraction. When those elements fade, there may not be much left to hold the connection in its previous form. This doesn't mean the relationship was false. It means it was context-dependent. When context changes, form changes. The shock comes from expecting continuity without the conditions that created it. There's also grief here, and it's often unacknowledged. You may miss people who are still present. You may feel nostalgic for versions of yourself that fit more easily into certain spaces. This grief doesn't require resolution. It requires honesty. Pretending nothing has changed prolongs the discomfort. Naming the shift internally allows it to settle. Another bias becomes visible at this stage, the idea that awakening should feel expansive in all directions. In reality, it often involves narrowing, fewer tolerances, fewer compulsions, fewer automatic agreements. This narrowing can feel like contraction, but it's actually refinement. Just as a signal becomes clearer when interference is reduced, your life begins to simplify around what resonates. Not everyone resists consciously. Some simply can't perceive what you're responding to. They're still oriented toward external validation, familiar timelines, inherited goals. From their perspective, you may appear vague or impractical. From yours, they may appear locked into narratives that no longer feel real. Both perceptions can coexist without either being wrong. The shock is realizing that mutual understanding is no longer guaranteed. This realization can tempt you to pull away prematurely, to retreat into solitude and avoid the discomfort altogether. But avoidance is just another pattern. The shift doesn't require withdrawal, it requires discernment. Some connections will adapt, others will soften rather than break. A few will fade naturally without drama. Letting this happen without forcing outcomes is part of the recalibration. You may also notice that new connections begin forming differently, less through shared identity, more through shared presence. Conversations feel simpler, yet more substantive. There's less need to impress or align on opinions. These connections often arrive quietly, without the intensity of old bonds, but with a steadiness that feels unfamiliar at first. They don't replace what was lost. They reflect what has changed. The deepest part of the shock is accepting that no one owes you resonance, and you owe no one stagnation. This isn't a declaration you make outwardly. It's an internal permission to stop carrying responsibility for other people's readiness, to stop slowing your perception to maintain comfort. This permission doesn't harden you. It frees energy that was tied up in managing expectations. As this settles, another layer becomes apparent. The separation you feel externally mirrors a separation dissolving internally. Old inner voices lose authority. Conflicting drives fall quiet. The sense of being pulled in multiple directions decreases. What looked like loss on the surface reveals itself as coherence underneath. And with that coherence comes a new question, less emotional and more precise. If consciousness awakens individually, and alignment reshapes reality at this level, then what you're becoming is not defined by who stays or who leaves, but by how you now relate to what you observe, and how deeply that observation itself is altering the field you move within. You are not who they told you you were, not the roles you learned to perform, not the patterns you inherited, not the expectations that shaped your early decisions. What has been unfolding throughout this experience is not an upgrade of an old identity, but a quiet release from it. The clarity you're sensing doesn't come from adding beliefs or reaching conclusions. It comes from removing interference and noticing what remains when you stop outsourcing perception. This video appeared at this moment because something in you was already ready to recognize itself, not as an idea, but as a stable presence behind thought, time, and reaction. From here, life won't necessarily become easier, but it will become more coherent, less forced, less borrowed, more precise. If you made it to the end, write this exact sentence in the comments. I stayed until the signal became clear. And if this resonated, choose one of the videos appearing on the screen now. They continue this exploration from a different angle, for those who want to go deeper and stay aligned with what's already changing.